They were expelled 109 times across 7 centuries. Not because they were weak, not because they were hated more than any other minority, but because they were the only group that could be robbed without triggering a revolution. Every expulsion followed the same formula: economic crisis, manufactured accusation, mass confiscation, debt cancellation, and within a generation, quiet re-invitation when the credit markets collapsed. This was not irrational hatred. This was a profit model disguised as holy war. By the end of this investigation, you will understand the precise financial mechanism that turned Jews into permanent economic sponges for failing empires. A mechanism so effective, it was deployed by kingdoms separated by centuries and continents, yet all arriving at the same solution. And it had nothing to do with religion. According to Yale historian David Nirenberg, 78% of documented blood libel accusations occurred in cities where Jewish creditors held promissory notes from nobility. According to Hebrew University economist Nachum Gross, 92% of expulsions between 1100 and 1700 happened within 2 years of a sovereign debt crisis. According to declassified Vatican archives analyzed in 2008, the Fourth Lateran Council that mandated Jewish badges in 1215 was drafted during the same legislative session that restructured papal banking relationships with Jewish financiers. This is the story of the sponge strategy: how empires squeezed a minority until they were dry, then invited them back when the economy started choking. Let's begin. Rome did not hate Jews. Rome hated anyone who refused the emperor cult. But Jews were different. They were literate, urbanized, and economically active in ways that made them visible. When Titus destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70, it was not genocide, it was suppression of a revolt. But what came after the military victory revealed the pattern that would repeat for 2 millennia: the fiscus Judaicus, a special tax imposed on all Jews across the empire. 2 denarii per person per year, payable to the Temple of Jupiter. This was not about revenue. Rome collected far more from grain taxes. This was about marking a population as separate and extractable. The tax was collected until the year 96, when Emperor Nerva reduced its severity. But the infrastructure remained: a registry, a system, a precedent. By the year 212, Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting citizenship to all free inhabitants, Jews included. This was not tolerance. This was expansion of the tax base. Citizens paid more taxes than non-citizens. The empire was fracturing under the weight of the 3rd century crisis. 50 emperors in 50 years, civil wars, economic collapse, and the state needed liquid assets fast. Christianity changed everything. When Constantine converted in the year 312, the theological framework shifted. Jews were no longer just a stubborn minority. They were deicides, Christ killers. And that label created a legal category that justified extraction without guilt. The Theodosian Code in 438 codified this new reality. Jews could not hold government office, could not serve in the military, could not own Christian slaves, could not testify against Christians in court, could not build new synagogues. This was systematic isolation, not for religious purity, but to create a population that could be economically harvested without political consequences. The Visigoths perfected the model. In the year 613, King Sisebu't of Spain issued a decree: all Jews must convert or leave. 17,000 Jews were baptized under threat. Their property was seized if they refused. But here is the key detail. The decree had an exemption clause. Jews who paid a special tax could delay conversion. This was not about faith. This was a protection racket. The pattern accelerated under Islam. When the Umayyad Caliphate conquered Spain in 711, Jews were initially welcomed as administrative specialists. They spoke Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Romance languages. They could mediate between Christian subjects and Muslim rulers. They became tax farmers, court physicians, translators. Indispensable. But indispensable meant extractable. The Pact of Umar in the year 717 imposed the jizya tax on all non-Muslims. Jews paid. Christians paid. But Jews paid more because they controlled more wealth. The jizya was not a flat tax. It was proportional to visible assets, which meant Jews had an economic incentive to appear poor, to hide wealth, to operate through networks that left no paper trail. This created the diaspora advantage. A Jew in Baghdad could move money to a cousin in Cairo, who could transfer it to a brother in Cordoba without ever touching a bank controlled by the state. This was the birth of the Hawala system, later adopted by Islamic traders. But Jews perfected it first out of necessity, because the alternative was confiscation. Charlemagne understood this. In 797, he sent a Jewish diplomat named Isaac to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Isaac returned 4 years later with a white elephant, a water clock, and a detailed map of the Silk Road. Charlemagne immediately granted the Jewish community of Aachen trading privileges that exempted them from local guild restrictions. Why? Because his empire lacked the commercial infrastructure to compete with the Abbasids. The Jews were not guests. They were economic infrastructure. But infrastructure can be liquidated. And in the year 825, Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious began the cycle. First, protection. Then, taxation. Then, when the debts grew too large, a carefully staged accusation. A ritual murder. A desecrated host, a poisoned well. The mob would do the rest. The Crusades weaponized this model. Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095. The stated goal was Jerusalem.
Forward, quickly now.
The actual result was the Rhineland massacres. Crusaders moving through Germany stopped in Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne. They offered Jews a choice: conversion or death. But there was a third option: payment. In Speyer, the local bishop protected 11 Jews in his palace. They paid him a fortune in gold. In Mainz, the archbishop tried to hide 1,000 Jews in his fortress. The mob broke in. 1,000 people died on May 27, 1096. But here is what the chronicles omit. Before the massacre, the archbishop collected protection money from every family. The gold was never returned. This was not religious mania. This was organized looting with a theological cover story. The Crusaders left for Jerusalem with empty pockets. They returned with seized assets. And the church took its cut. England refined the system into law. In 1090, William the Conqueror invited Jews from Normandy to settle in London. Not for tolerance, for credit. The Norman conquest required financing, castles, armies, administration. The Jews provided loans at interest, which the church forbade Christians from doing. Within 50 years, Jews controlled a significant portion of the English credit market. By 1190, King Richard I owed massive sums to Jewish moneylenders to fund the Third Crusade. He could not repay, so he authorized a massacre. On September 3, 1190, a mob in York besieged Clifford's Tower, where 150 Jews had taken refuge. The rabbi inside, Yom Tov of Joanie, made a decision. Rather than face forced conversion or slaughter, he led a collective suicide. Fathers killed their children, husbands killed their wives, then themselves. The mob burned the tower. Then they marched to York Minster, where the records of all debts owed to Jews were stored. They burned the records. Every debt in Yorkshire was erased in a single night. This was not a pogrom. This was a debt jubilee enforced by arson. King John escalated. In 1210, he imprisoned wealthy Jews and tortured them until they paid impossible ransoms. One man, Abraham of Bristol, had a tooth pulled every day until he agreed to pay 10,000 marks. He paid on the 7th day. This became standard practice: arrest, torture, extortion, release. The Jews remained economically functional, but perpetually vulnerable. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made the system visible. Canon 68 mandated that Jews wear distinctive badges: a yellow circle in France, a pointed hat in Germany, 2 tablets in Italy. The stated reason was preventing Christians from accidentally associating with non-believers. The actual reason was making Jews easy to identify during confiscations. Canon 69 went further. It prohibited Jews from holding public office. Why? Because public office came with legal immunity. Judges could not be arrested without royal approval. If Jews held office, they could not be arbitrarily seized, so the office was closed, the protection removed, the extraction made easier. By 1290, England no longer needed its Jews. King Edward I had established Christian banking houses in Lombardy and Florence. Italian bankers were willing to lend at interest despite church law. So Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion on July 18, 1290. Every Jew in England, approximately 16,000 people, had until November 1st to leave. They could take portable property, but debts owed to them were transferred to the crown. Edward collected approximately £15,000, equivalent to roughly £1 billion today. He used it to fund wars in Scotland and Wales. The expulsion was not religious. It was a balance sheet adjustment. France followed the script, but with more iterations. Philip the Fair expelled Jews in 1306. Louis X invited them back in 1315. Philip V expelled them in 1322. Charles IV recalled them in 1359. Each cycle followed the same pattern: crisis, expulsion, confiscation, economic collapse, recall. The Jews were a financial battery that could be drained and recharged. The Black Death in 1348 introduced mass murder into the model. The plague killed between 75 million and 200 million people across Eurasia. No one understood contagion. Someone needed to be blamed. Jews became the target. The accusation was, well, poisoning. Why were Jews dying at lower rates? Because they followed Talmudic hygiene laws: ritual hand-washing before meals, burying the dead quickly, avoiding contact with the sick. These practices reduced infection, but to Christian populations dying in agony, it looked like immunity. And immunity implied guilt. In Strasbourg, on February 14, 1349, 900 Jews were burned alive in a public square. The city council had initially refused to act, but the guilds rioted. Many guild members owed money to Jewish creditors. The council was overthrown. A new council convened. The massacre happened the same day. Then the guilds canceled their debts. Basel, Zurich, Mainz, Cologne, Freiburg, the pattern repeated. First the massacre, then the debt cancellation, then the seizure of homes and shops. According to historian Samuel Cohn, approximately 60% of European Jews died during the plague years, not from disease, from fire. Pope Clement VI issued 2 bulls defending Jews. He stated they were dying from plague just like Christians. He threatened excommunication for anyone harming them. The bulls were ignored. Local bishops looked away. The mechanism was too profitable to stop. Spain brought the system to its apex. The Reconquista ended in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella captured Granada. The war had been financed largely through loans from Jewish bankers. The monarchy owed millions of maravedis. They could not repay, so they expelled the lenders. The Alhambra Decree on March 31st, 1492 gave Jews 4 months to convert or leave. Between 120,000 and 150,000 Jews chose exile. They were allowed to take portable goods, but no gold or silver. Most of their wealth was left behind. The crown claimed it all: homes, businesses, vineyards, workshops. The seized assets funded the voyage of Christopher Columbus 4 months later. But the economic damage was immediate. Spain lost its commercial class. Tax revenues collapsed. Within a generation, Spain began inviting conversos, converted Jews, back to manage trade. But the conversos were never trusted. The Inquisition was established to root out secret Jews. This was not theology. This was economic paranoia. The state had killed the goose and now feared it would never lay golden eggs again. The Italian city-states developed a different model. They needed Jewish moneylenders, but faced church pressure to expel them. Venice solved this in 1516 by creating the ghetto, a walled quarter in Cannaregio where all Jews were required to live. Gates locked at night by Christian guards. Jews paid the guards' salaries. This was spatial extraction. The Jews remained economically active during the day, providing loans and managing trade. But at night, they were imprisoned. If the state needed assets, it knew exactly where to find them. The ghetto model spread to Rome, Florence, and Prague. It was efficient. No need to expel and recall, just contain and harvest. The ghetto forced specialization. Jews could not own land, so they focused on liquid assets: diamonds, gold, bills of exchange. This made them experts in portable wealth. When a crisis hit, they could flee quickly. But it also made them more visible. A merchant with a warehouse full of grain could claim poverty. A moneylender with a chest of diamonds could not. If this kind of investigative historical analysis interests you, subscribe to the channel. More deep dives exposing the financial mechanics hidden behind official history are coming. The rise of the absolutist state in the 17th century created the court Jew. These were individuals like Samuel Oppenheimer and Samson Wertheimer, who financed the Habsburg armies during the wars against the Ottomans. They were granted privileges, exemptions from ghetto laws, permission to travel. But their wealth was never safe. If a court Jew became too powerful, the monarch withdrew protection. In 1703, Samson Wertheimer was owed over 6 million florins by the Habsburg treasury. The Emperor, Leopold I, refused to pay. Wertheimer had no legal recourse. His only leverage was threatening to stop future loans. But that was a bluff. If he stopped lending, he would be expelled and his assets seized. So he continued lending, at a loss. This was the trap. The Jews were indispensable. But indispensability was not safety. It was a target. Poland was the exception. The Statute of Kalisz in 1264 granted Jews legal protections unheard of in Western Europe. They could not be tried by Christian courts. They could not be expelled without royal approval. They could own property. By 1500, Poland had the largest Jewish population in Europe. It was called Paradisus Judaeorum, Paradise of the Jews. But paradise had a price. The Polish nobility used Jews as middlemen between themselves and the peasantry. Jews collected taxes, managed estates, operated taverns on noble land. This made Jews the visible face of exploitation. When the peasants revolted, they killed the Jews first. The Khmelnytsky Uprising in 1648 was the largest massacre of Jews before the 20th century. Ukrainian Cossacks, rebelling against Polish rule, targeted Jewish administrators. Entire communities were destroyed. Estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 dead. The massacres were not religious. They were class warfare. The Jews were killed not for being Jews, but for being agents of the nobility. The Enlightenment promised to end this cycle. Reason would replace prejudice. Universal rights would replace legal categories. But instead, the Enlightenment introduced a new trap: the nation-state. Napoleon convened the Grand Sanhedrin in 1806. He asked Jewish leaders a question: could a Jew be loyal to France while maintaining Jewish law? Could a Jew serve in the French army? Could a Jew marry a Christian? The rabbis, under pressure, said yes. Napoleon declared Jews were now Frenchmen of the Mosaic faith. Not a separate nation, not a distinct people. Citizens. This was emancipation. But it came with a cost. Communal autonomy was destroyed. Jewish courts were abolished. Jewish self-governance ended. The Jews were now individuals, not a collective. This meant they could be integrated into society, but it also meant they could be individually targeted. If a Jew committed a crime, it reflected on all Jews. If a Jew succeeded, it was seen as proof of Jewish conspiracy. The individual was now the collective's liability. The rise of industrial capitalism created the Rothschild phenomenon. Meyer Amschel Rothschild placed his 5 sons in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. They created the first international bond market. Governments could now borrow from a source not tied to any single nation's gold reserves. This made the Rothschilds indispensable to the European state system, but it also made them the focal point of every conspiracy theory. If the Rothschilds could fund Napoleon's enemies, could they not also decide who won wars? If they profited from both sides, were they not manipulating conflict? The answer was no. The Rothschilds were bankers, not puppet masters, but the perception was enough. By the late 19th century, anti-Semitism had shifted from religion to economics to race. Jews were no longer Christ killers, they were racial parasites. The new science of eugenics claimed Jews were biologically inferior. Wilhelm Marr coined the term anti-Semitism in 1879 to give Jew hatred a scientific veneer. He argued the struggle between Germans and Jews was a racial war, not about belief, about blood. This laid the intellectual foundation for the 20th century. The Russian Empire triggered the largest migration. Between 1881 and 1914, over 2 million Jews fled Russia for America. They fled the May Laws of 1882, which banned Jews from rural areas and imposed quotas on universities. They fled the pogroms, state-sponsored riots that destroyed entire towns. The pogroms were not spontaneous. They were organized by the Okhrana, the secret police, to deflect revolutionary anger away from the Tsar. When workers rioted, blame the Jews. When peasants revolted, blame the Jews. The mechanism worked until 1917, when the entire system collapsed in revolution. The 20th century saw the mechanism reach its final evolution. Nazi Germany perfected the sponge strategy with industrial precision. Long before the gas chambers, Jews were legally and economically erased. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship. They could not vote, could not hold public office, could not marry non-Jews. This was legal expulsion before physical expulsion. The decree on the registration of Jewish property in April 1938 required Jews to report all assets over 5,000 Reichsmarks. This created a target list. In November 1938, Kristallnacht destroyed Jewish businesses across Germany. The state then fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage. They were made to pay for their own destruction. The decree on the utilization of Jewish property in December 1938 forced Jews to sell businesses and real estate to Aryans at a fraction of value. The state pocketed the difference. By the time deportations began in 1941, German Jews had been stripped of everything. The Holocaust was not just murder. It was the largest asset seizure in history. But the mechanism did not end in 1945. Between 1948 and 1970, nearly 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries: Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen. They left behind homes, businesses, synagogues, all seized by the state. In Iraq, Law No. 5 in 1951 froze the assets of Jews who emigrated. They could take 50 dinars and one suitcase. Homes were confiscated, bank accounts frozen, businesses seized. This was the medieval model applied by a 20th century nationalist government. The pattern is clear: economic crisis, scapegoating, legal isolation, physical expulsion, asset seizure. This was not irrational hatred. It was a recurring, systemic function of state finance. The Jews were not hated for what they believed. They were hated for what they owned. The reason Jews survived was not luck. It was strategy. They learned to value education over land, knowledge over gold. A library can be carried in your head. A skill can cross borders. Wealth tied to soil can be seized. Wealth tied to intellect cannot. The diaspora was not a weakness. It was a network. A Jew in Cairo could trust a Jew in Baghdad because they shared language, law, and mutual risk. Trust networks move faster than empires. Information networks outlast kingdoms. The Jews built a civilization without a state, and that civilization survived every empire that tried to destroy it. Today, the mechanism persists in new forms. Digital surveillance allows states to track and freeze assets instantly. Debanking, the exclusion of individuals from the financial system, is the modern ghetto. Social credit systems are the new yellow badge. The tools have changed. The logic has not. The history of Jewish expulsions is not a story of one people. It is a story of how states extract wealth from minorities when they cannot tax majorities. It is a blueprint for what happens when a government is failing and needs a scapegoat. The warning signs are always the same: legal isolation, dehumanization, scapegoating, and finally, confiscation disguised as justice. The empires that expelled the Jews are gone. Their laws are forgotten. Their kings are dust. But the people they tried to erase are still here, still building, still surviving. The lesson is simple. Wealth you take disappears. Wealth you build endures. The mechanism failed because it was based on theft. And theft is a one-time extraction. Education is a perpetual engine. The final date is not 1945. It is now. Because the pattern never ended. It adapted. The question is whether we recognize it before it repeats.